over a year after the release of ActRaiser, Quintet would return to their roots, making a game that should feel a lot more familiar to players who had followed them since their Falcom days, but one that would also shape the direction of their future output on the Super Nintendo. After laying dormant for quite a long time, let's finally break the seal on this channel. It's time to talk about Soul Blazer. Soul Blazer, or Soul Blader as it's known in Japan, is an action RPG following the journey of a hero dressed in all red in his quest to bring back life to the planet after a massive incident. The brilliant inventor/artist Dr. Leo was ordered by the king to open the gates of hell in a foolish bid for more power and wealth. So now the hero, on a mission from the Master, is sent down to Earth to seal away the monsters, and freeing the souls of all the people, restoring the balance that was lost in a catastrophic accident that swept away all life at the hands of the evil Death Toll. And the way you do this is by exploring the dungeons and defeating monsters in them. Combat in Soul Blazer is straightforward. You've got a large swinging attack, and you can hold your sword in front of you by holding down the shoulder buttons, which also lets you crab walk, and that's basically it. Fighting enemies in Soul Blazer is more about positioning yourself properly than it is about pure action, especially early on. Finding that sweet spot where enemies come in range so you can quickly take them down before they get a chance at hurting you back. Usually hitting them off center works best. Which sounds a bit simplistic, and it definitely is, but it does have this satisfying feeling of popping bubble wrap, which I don't think is a coincidence. Popping bubble wrap was the exact sensation that the original Ys developers had in mind when trying to make bump combat feel satisfying. And it works wonders in Soul Blazer too. Especially since there's a secondary layer to taking down monsters in this game. Enemies appear from spawn points. Once you defeat enough enemies, the spawn point pops with this satisfying sound. Once a spawn point has popped, you walk over it like a switch and... you release one of the people swept away by the incident. Or sometimes you unlock the path forward, or open up more enemy spawn points, or a shortcut back. You know that feeling in old Zelda games when you're locked in a room in a dungeon and have to clear out all the enemies, and when you do, a key drops? Soul Blazer is that exact feeling on loop. You're always unlocking or opening up something. There's a great feeling of constant forward momentum here, which is satisfying enough by itself, but it's that moment you finally return to town that is the biggest reward of all. Although you technically do travel from town to town in this game, every town is basically its own zone or world that you teleport to from a central hub. The towns themselves are empty upon arriving there. No buildings, no cell phones, no people, nothing. As you progress through the dungeon areas, the towns start coming to life, filling up with people, plants, animals, and buildings. I always quite liked the visual detail of the buildings popping up in multiple phases. They could have just popped up in full visuals of the building in one go, but seeing it get built up gives this extra feeling of really having built up this town again. On the flip side, the dungeons actually empty out over time. Once a spawn point is gone, it's gone. It doesn't return. Quite often you need items from the towns in order to progress further in the dungeons. So this back and forth between the town and the dungeon pushing each other forward gives the game a really nice sense of variety. Going back and forth between dungeon crawling and interacting with the town you've helped rebuild still makes it feel like some of that ActRaiser DNA is alive and well, despite the genre and presentation being so wildly different. At least the grunt the player character makes upon being hit is still there. One interesting note is that there's no shops or money in Soul Blazer. The closest equivalent to money you get are the gems that monsters drop. Given their appearance, you'd think that this is money, but gems double as your MP. And magic in this game is, it's there. And if you go out of your way to use it, it isn't entirely useless. There's a handful of places where you really do need to use magic because the enemies are out of range, but outside of that it's kind of not great since you're firing most spells from this floating fairy that's constantly circling you. It makes positioning magic spells really difficult. It's one of the main things I wish was a bit better in Soul Blazer, but still, the game overall is still a lot nicer to play than Falcom's attempts at bringing Ys over to the same platform. So, things could be worse. And yeah, it is funny to think about how the old Ys developers were having a hell of a run on the Super Nintendo, while their old publisher was struggling to get a foothold on it. Barring a couple of boss fights, Soul Blazer never becomes all that difficult. You are basically spawn-killing enemies on repeat, so it makes sense that the game isn't too punishing or difficult. Barring a couple of boss fights, there isn't too much pushback until the last two worlds, and even then, if you die, all you lose are your gems, so death isn't all that punishing either. The townsfolk came back from it just fine, so why shouldn't you? There's 2 inventory items in this game to mitigate loss. The first one is your main healing item, herbs. They work like rations in Metal Gear. Once your HP hits 0, you get a second lease on life with a full heal once. The other is a strange vase, which lets you keep your gems upon death. Gems mean so little to me, I've never wasted the playtime to open a menu and select this item before death. Maybe you get more use out of it, I don't know, but I never used magic enough to feel the lack of MP after dying. Soul Blazer's feeling of variety is made even better by every world having 2 major dungeon areas. I guess if this was a modern game, we'd call these biomes or maybe even tile sets, but this is not a modern game, so we're not going to call it that. For example, the first town has you going to the mines at first, until you get Mario 64'd into a painting. Speaking of the N64, I always found it interesting that you spent the game accompanied by a fairy circling around you. But I am kind of getting ahead of myself with these Zelda comparisons, that's something for another video. Later areas have you going back and forth between the 2 dungeon areas more frequently, giving you a refreshing back and forth. I quite like the old town model area and the research lab world. I wish more games would let you stomp around tiny toy towns as if you're a giant kaiju, without being a full kaiju game outright. The individual dungeon areas themselves tend to have good variety per screen too, so there's some good scenic variety on display, doubled by the fact that you keep getting these brief looks at the town progressing alongside your dungeon dives. The townsfolk aren't all utility, the majority of them are there for flavor, and since you can't talk to all of the people in town in one go before moving on, you do get this sense of spending a longer period of time with them without it feeling too stretched out. You're never locked into town until you talk to every single NPC or anything ridiculous like that. This isn't modern Falcom. The dialogue in Soul Blazer is interesting. Maybe it's because the entire setting has essentially died once already. Maybe it's because even before the big calamity there was a power struggle going on that made people lose loved ones. But there's something distinctly melancholic and almost philosophical about the way that the NPCs talk. It's not attempting to be too deep for you or anything like that, but all the different towns have very different types of life on it, with the game's text highlighting both this sense of cultural difference and approach in life, almost as if from the point of view of a native being eager to show a tourist their way of being. Like the goat gladly giving you a town tour from his perspective, or the dog clearly curious to see what the stranger is doing here, following you around, only to brush it off as a coincidence that he just happens to be going the same way that you are when you talk to him. Or the gnomish creature with a 1-year lifespan, saying he's perfectly content idling his life away while sitting across from his loved one like this, while his girlfriend is thinking that maybe life's too short to spend too much of her precious time with this guy. She should probably find someone else before it's too late. The atmosphere in the game is almost dreamy. Almost. Until you step into people's dreams and see their hopes and actual ambitions. Literally. Usually reflected in echoes of the past that characters can't let go of. the game does a mostly great job at conveying slightly heavy subject matter in a light enough way until the end. Near the end, there's a dramatic sequence that I'm not going to spoil for people who haven't played the game yet, but basically the translation kind of just falls apart during this. It's not all too great before this either, but it especially stands out when the game tries to be a bit heavier than it was before, and the translation just cannot carry all that weight. It was probably too much text at once, too close to a deadline, something like that. Maybe the scope of the text was just simply too much for early video game translations. Japanese games were already starting to get increasingly used to more dramatic styles of storytelling, and a lot of the games doing that wouldn't get released because the real text-heavy output wasn't on consoles. And the console output, the RPGs, most of it would not get a Western release. So the West wouldn't really open their eyes to this until, I almost want to say, Metal Gear Solid. That game resembling a Hollywood movie enough instead of pulling from fantasy novels the way that most story-driven Japanese games did at the time, including ActRaiser and Soul Blazer. That's the real eye-opening moment Western studios realized that the medium could be like movies without having to be an interactive video presentation. I also played the Japanese version of Soul Blazer, and it doesn't struggle in this leg of the game at all. It does have this other major issue. The entire game is written in kana, which is fairly common for a game of this era, although by this time it was slowly getting phased out in favor of at least having some kanji present. For those who don't speak Japanese, hiragana and katakana are the phonetic alphabet, while kanji are the Chinese characters. The written language flows a lot nicer when you have kanji present. It breaks things up very nicely, and in a language made up of so few sounds, it makes it more immediately clear which words are being written. A game fully written in kana means it's written out entirely phonetically, and even in English, this isn't all that fun or practical to read that way either. Old Japanese games often did this because more characters meant more font data needing to be stored. Text boxes largely recall that stored data to visualize the text on screen. English font data only needs 26 characters to function, not counting punctuation or numbers. Japanese has two kana character sets known as 50 sound alphabets, with several thousand kanji on top of that, so you can easily see where restrictions would come in and why earlier games could end up becoming a pain like this. Until the PlayStation 1, developers were scraping for every single byte of data as is. It's one of the main reasons Japanese console games grew in maturity alongside the available space that they had to work with. Not in terms of gore, sex, and violence, but in terms of what kind of story they could convey. All of this said, I do find it interesting that when releasing someone from a monster spawn, the Japanese version has a slightly different text box than the Western release. The English version will tell you, above released an old woman, while the Japanese release says, above wa obasan no tamashi o kaihou shita. Above released the soul of an old woman. It's a minor detail, but the omission of the word soul is a bit interesting considering, you know, the word soul is in the title of this video game. I mean, you are the Soul Blazer and all. Actually, no, wait, you're the Soul Blader in the original release, because the Soul Blade is an actual weapon in the game that you get, and you're the person wielding it. Also, the title screen changed color for some reason. I guess the logic here is that blading requires cold steel, but blazing should be a bit warmer. It's all very confusing. But not as confusing as the PAL release of this game, which I actually had no memory of existing even though I played this game back in the day. My experience with Soul Blazer was through an American import using a converter to play it on my European Super Nintendo. I didn't even know that there was a PAL release until I was looking up information for this game for this video and noticing Wikipedia says there's a PAL release, which, sure, okay. But it actually gets stranger than this. Soul Blazer was released in 1993 in Scandinavia, completely in English. For some reason, this version didn't make it to other countries here. Maybe if you were very lucky and knew a game store owner or rental shop in the know, they might have gotten their hands on this release. That sort of thing occasionally happened. A few game stores here had that awful Dragon Ball GT PS1 fighting game on store shelves during the big Dragon Ball boom. You know, the French-only version of that game. 1 year after the Scandinavian release in 1994, Soul Blazer got a second European release by Ubisoft. This only released in France and Germany and only supports their regional languages. No English text. Also, I find it funny that Ubisoft just took the artwork and logo of the actual company behind the game off the cartridge. I'm used to American companies trying to claim ownership of Japanese IP, but seeing a French company doing it, that's new to me. It's a very strange situation, and trust me, the strangeness in localization remains a thing throughout Quintet's entire output. The only thing that's consistent from this point on is Turbo the dog. There's a couple of other changes that I want to point out that are much more well known to people. The first boss is a lot easier in the Japanese version. In the Western release, there's this bizarre difficulty spike when fighting him, because they intentionally messed up the conveyor belts to make the fight harder than it's supposed to be. The carpet tiling looks kind of messed up because of this. One of the bosses was a nude lady who got turned into a dude because the existence of women was deemed too shocking for Western audiences. The eyes of a female character during the ending visuals were changed. An anime art style might have given away that this was a game made by foreigners published for a piece of hardware made by even more foreigners, something that naturally had to be hidden from American audiences at all costs. And then there's the font. The Japanese release uses a fairly standard looking font, while the Western release would opt for the stylish, nice looking font that would become the call sign to Quintet's output on the Super Nintendo. What I didn't know was that this font actually already existed in the Japanese release. It appears during the credit roll. So localization people probably saw this font, figured it was good enough, and then proceeded to use it for all the text in the game. And you know what? This was the greatest call they made during the entire game's localization because it became one of the backbones to the series' identity in the West. For this video's thumbnail, I am using a version of it that you can easily find online called Lunchtime, doubly so. A name that'll probably make more sense once we talk about the localization of the next title in the series. Also, Soul Blazer has some fantastic music. I might like ActRaiser's Fillmore more than I do any individual track of this game, but I like the overall music as a whole package here a lot better. There's some great grooves in Soul Blazer. Fun bit of trivia, but the music here was actually not by Yuzo Koshiro for once. Yukihide Takegawa took the helm composing this one. If you've ever seen that old live-action adaptation of Saiyuki, simply known as Monkey in the West, you might remember the intro and outro songs, Monkey Magic and Gandara. He worked on those, being the vocalist for GODIEGO and performing the songs in both Japanese and English. It's not the kind of name that you would expect pop up during the credits of a 16-bit RPG, but here we are. So, do I recommend Soul Blazer? Yeah, it's a great time. The game's foundation is a bit simple, but there's a good flow, and that feeling of constantly working towards something creates for such a fun and satisfying experience. The game still holds up very well to this day. Anyway, this was AboveUp. It's been a while since the last video. Years, in fact. I've mostly kept busy with Japanese studies and started a new job. I've actually been to Japan by now. I had zero problems with the language there. I could just speak to anyone, go into a bookstore, find the books that I'm looking for, and read them. I've also replayed a ton of games in the language. All of them have been a better experience than playing any localized version. It's been a really great time. I'll talk a bit more about what I've been up to in a later video. We'll be moving forward with the Soul Blazer series since this is near and dear to my heart, and past that, well, we'll see what we'll cover then. Probably something fun. So, I want to thank everyone for having been really patient with me, and I'll see ya.